tell us more about what you're expecting.
You might prefer to listen to Bruno Mars, I don't know, but I'll fill the gap that Bruno doesn't whilst we wait for the Chancellor. It's going to happen any moment now. The Prime Minister's just walked past, actually. He's got rid of his orange fluorescent jacket and he's heading into the hall, as is de rigueur when the Chancellor of the Exchequer gives his conference speech. Traditionally, one of the set-piece events of a Conservative or governing party conference, hearing from the Chancellor. I don't think we're going to get very much whiz-bangery, if you like. I don't think there's going to be anything that is sparklingly new or anything that is a big shift of one of the big levers at a Chancellor's control on income tax or anything radical like that. Instead, it'll be picking up the baton, if you like, of the conversation you were having a few moments ago around the economic context at the moment of the furlough scheme coming to an end, the end of the uplift to universal credit, that additional £20 a week offered to recipients of universal credit during the pandemic. I think we'll hear quite a bit from the Chancellor about additional support for people to get into jobs and to stay in jobs, particularly younger people, but also the over 50s. And I think we'll also get a bit of Rishi Sunak doing the "this is who I am" thing, because he's only been Chancellor for 18 months. I mean, blimey, what an 18 months. Within weeks of him getting the job, he was having to split. Blimey. Payers' money, and that'll motivate the decisions that come. In many ways, that is, whilst also his political philosophy, an insight into how things will get harder for him politically. Lots of polls internally within Conservative Party members bill Rishi Sunak pretty highly. He is liked by activists, but arguably it's quite easy to be liked by the party faithful and the broader electorate when you're splurging lots of money. A little tougher when you are having to make much tougher decisions, the likes of which are likely to come. I think what we're going to get in the next moment or two, I think the gentleman we're hearing from now is a recipient of Kickstart support. This is one of the job schemes that the Chancellor launched during the pandemic and is being extended. It's where the taxpayer picks up the bill for 6 months of a young employee's wages, meaning that the company doesn't have to shoulder that financial burden, in the hope that over those 6 months they develop the necessary skills to be taken on as a full-time employee afterwards. So I think within a few minutes we'll have the Chancellor doing his thing. We think, Joanna, he's going to speak for around about half an hour. As I say, I think it'll be a mix of the personal, the specific around jobs, and then the broader economic context in which we find ourselves. And we will tease out and see, I think, the character differences between the Prime Minister and the Chancellor. The Chancellor instinctively pretty serious of mind in his public presentations, doesn't go for the kind of rhetorical flourishes that we get from the Prime Minister, and no doubt an insight into the tough conversations going on within government ahead of a spending review and a budget around the whole business of financing in a post-pandemic era, after a huge amount of public spending and a huge ratcheting up of borrowing and debt as a result, and the beginnings of the difficult decisions to come. We're seeing them around universal credit, for instance, where some of those spending taps have to be eased, which is not an easy thing for a Chancellor to do. It's very easy in an emergency to add money to people's benefits. Very difficult, even when economic conditions improve. Benefit. To take that money away. So after an extraordinary 18 months for a Chancellor, his first 18 months in the job. In many senses, perhaps the more difficult time, less extraordinary but more difficult, is still to come as we emerge out of the economy and those tough decisions tumble towards him.
Chris, is it fair to say there's a bit of a narrative becoming clear that's defining a difference between Labour and the Tories right now around immigration and jobs and what's paid for jobs in this country?
There is no doubt there is. So the argument the government makes here around the whole question of the shortages that we're seeing at the moment, whether it be at petrol stations or butchers, abattoir workers, you name it, is that this is a transition driven by Brexit and the desire of many people who backed Brexit to see a lower level of immigration and a higher level of domestic wage rates, that this is the economy in transition and these are the symptoms of that transition. And I think the political calculation that the government is making is that they hope that people will say, look, these are necessary changes that private sector employers need to make, and if they haven't made them up until now, that is their fault, not the government's. The big test is going to be in the coming months, depending on how long these bumps continue, is to what extent do people blame, for instance, the haulage industry for not offering better terms and conditions, for not employing more British staff, versus blaming the government because the occupier of number 10 tends to get blamed for a lot of stuff, whether they're directly responsible for it or not. I think that's the political dynamic there. We saw last week Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader in Brighton, saying he would be much more liberal in allowing more visas for foreign lorry drivers to meet that gap that there is as far as drivers are concerned, about 100,000 at the moment. The government is talking around about 5,000, so a much smaller number, because the government makes this argument that we are in this economically transitionary period between what they see as a high immigration, low wage economy and a lower immigration, high wage economy. But in order to mitigate against the worst effects of this current shortage, for instance, among HGV drivers, what has the government done? It has actually cranked the immigration lever, albeit temporarily and albeit with a relatively low number, certainly compared with what Sir Keir Starmer was advocating. So yeah, there's a definite difference there, and the Prime Minister absolutely determined to see this current series of economic bumps and inconveniences through that prism of Brexit in terms of delivering something that, in his view, the majority of people actually want to see, even if in the short term that causes these awkwardnesses, inconveniences and difficult headlines for individual industries and indeed for the government.
Chris, they've just started. Oh, here comes the Chancellor. We'll listen.